Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. It's time for another YouTube comments knowledge bomb. This is the segment where I answer your YouTube comments questions because I usually don't find the time to get in there and do it in text. But before I get into that, just real quick, if you haven't downloaded it already, check out my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description. This is my 5 steps to systematically treating a room and getting it to translate. If you're in the position of just treating your studio, if you're thinking about treating your studio, if you're in the process of just thinking about acoustics in your room and you're trying to figure out in which order to go through all the different steps that are included in treating your studio, then this guide is for you. This is the 5 steps that I take when I approach a home studio. So starting with setting up your, placing your setup, setting up your speakers, placing your listening position, thinking about treatment, thinking about the different types of treatment, thinking about measurements, thinking about subwoofers, thinking about decoupling, thinking about equalization, so room correction. In which order do you approach all these steps so that you don't end up turning in circles, maybe kind of jumping ahead and doing something that you should have done much earlier on in the process? So this is a top-level view to give you a guideline, a framework, a step-by-step process to follow, very top level, so you don't get lost in the process of treating your home studio. So this is my home studio treatment framework that you can download for free at the link in the description. And with that, let's jump right into the first question. This is by Sam's Voices, and it's on a video called "Can I Have Too Much Absorption?" Sam asks, does this mean we should only be using 6-inch foam panels? Then why is everybody stuck using their 1-inch or 2-inch ones? Does this also mean if we keep on increasing the thickness, we will ideally reach full absorption across the frequency range? Or does at any point increasing the thickness has a limitation to the even absorption? Thanks in advance. Sam, good question. So why is everybody stuck using 1-inch or 2-inch panels? Well, because they are cheaper, they are thinner, and obviously space is limited in your typical home studio. That's why, and obviously most companies sell these panels because they can sell them for cheaper. But in my opinion, they, unless you really don't have the space for something deeper, you don't really want to revert back to 1-inch or 2-inch panels at all, because they really only absorb the very, very high end. And as I mentioned in that video, that's one of the main reasons, or one of the main things that contributes to having a dead sounding room if you're over damping the high end. So you really want to focus on fewer deeper panels rather than more shallow panels. And onto the second part of your question, why does this also mean if we keep on increasing the thickness that we will reach full absorption across the frequency range? Technically, yes. Basically, the depth just influences, or the depth of the absorber primarily influences how much low frequency absorption you're going to get from that particular absorber, if you will. And yeah, technically, if you just make it deeper and deeper, at some point it will basically absorb the entire frequency range. There is one limit to this, or there is some limit to this. Basically, if you will, the effectiveness of adding more and more depth kind of drops off as you make these things really, really deep. It can be done, and it's done often. So you will find studios with 20 centimeters, 8 inches, or even 40 centimeters to 12 inches. So what is that? 20 inches, 18 inches, 16 inches, 16 inches of material. It does work, but in my opinion, there's a kind of a trade-off there, because the more you add, at some point you have to add more and more to get a significant increase in absorption, which is why many acousticians switch over to resonance absorbers for very deep frequency or very low frequency absorption at a certain point. But that's a tricky thing to do if you're just doing it for the first time. It's not trivial. So I still recommend you stick to porous absorption for your work, for your treatment, even if you're, not just if you're starting out, but even if you're kind of more advanced, if you're more experienced with treatment, you still want to stick to porous absorption, especially in a home studio, because it's just the better tool. Yeah, so that's kind of the second part to this. But I hope that answers your question. Let's keep on going to the next question. So this one is by Richard J. Neo on a video called Home Studio Acoustics, Why You Can't Calculate How Much Treatment You Need. And Richard asks, slightly off topic, but I've been looking at properties to purchase. So I've been paying attention to floor plans and punching them into AMROC, and something I've noticed is this. I know we say the bigger the room, the better, and I think it's because it's more diffuse, right? But when you get to a length of more than around 420 centimeters, your lowest standing wave dips below 40 hertz, which makes it harder to tame with absorption. At this length, to get a good distribution of modes, aka, or in brackets, Bonello, this corresponds to a width of around 300 centimeters, with a standard Australian modern roof height of 240 centimeters. This all seems very workable. But my question is, what's happening to the frequencies below 40 hertz? Obviously, the speaker is still pushing air and we can hear those frequencies. Are they still causing problems for us that are not related to standing waves that mean I should still go for a bigger room? So, first of all, there's a slight misconception in there. I know we say the bigger the better, and I think it's because it's more diffuse, right? To some extent, it's mainly, when we're talking home studios, it's mainly about kind of reverb real estate, if you will. Yeah, a bigger room tends to have a longer reverb times, which means that you have more reverb time to work with when you're absorbing that reverb time. It's harder to overdamp a bigger room. It also means that according to the room mode models, that the room modes, the standing waves, sit lower down in frequency with a bigger room. And once you go big enough, basically the lowest room modes fall below the auditory spectrum. Yeah, so below 20 hertz, if you will. And obviously that means at that point they don't cause a problem anymore. There's also just the fact that a bigger room has more space for treatment, and especially with very, very small rooms, that's one of the main limiting factors. It's just that the room is too small to do the amount of treatment that you need to get proper control. Yeah, you can usually go quite far, but there's a kind of a natural limit just because of physical space. And so because of all those reasons, I always say the bigger the room, the better. It just gives you more options, even if the room mode pattern isn't ideal in the bigger space. Just because you have more space, you probably still kind of end up with a better solution, or you can end up with a better solution. All right. Talking about this question, what happens with energy below the lowest room mode, let's say 40 hertz. So basically at that point, the room enters the pressure zone, and instead of room modes being able to build up because the waves don't fit between parallel surfaces anymore, what happens instead is that the air pressure in the room literally just rises all over. The best way to imagine this is if you're thinking about a dollhouse, let's say like a Barbie dollhouse, and you put a big balloon in the living room, and you just blow up that balloon, and it starts inflating and pressing against all the walls simultaneously, and the air pressure just rises because that balloon can't go anywhere. So that's kind of what happens below the room mode region of the spectrum in a small room. Yeah. So that's why you can still hear those frequencies just fine, and obviously the speaker still plays them. Now to your final question, are they still causing problems for us that are not related to standing waves that mean I should go for a bigger room? Yeah, so obviously these aren't standing waves anymore, so you don't get that associated resonance effect, and also obviously the time effect. Yeah, so in a way that makes your life easier, but is that a reason to go for the bigger room? Well, Again, the standing waves actually move down in frequency with the bigger room, so you're not removing that issue. I think I'm starting to turn in circles with my explanation here, but you get what I mean, I think, right? So it's bigger is better is still the way to go in most cases. All right, good question. So this next one is by Humperdew Saves on the same video. So home studio acoustics, why you can't calculate how much treatment you need, and Humperdew Saves asks, the more I read about it, the more it seems like a crapshoot, winky smile face. I have a living room, wrong layout, obviously cabinets, an L-shaped couch, etc., etc. I just about gave up on acoustics here. It wounds great at the moment, so I think I'll leave it alone. I'm really sorry to read this, my friend. I don't think any room is a lost cause, unless it's so tiny that putting some treatment in will literally leave you with kind of treatment right up against your ears. You can work with any room, yeah? And usually living rooms, kind of L-shaped, although the couch is L-shaped, not the living room. But living rooms tend to be rather bigger spaces, so there's usually quite a bit you can do. So don't give up just yet. I'm sure there's some things you can do. I know the realization that sometimes it's hard to get good sound in a room. Sometimes it takes quite a bit of compromise. Sometimes those realizations can be hard, but that's how it is. I think we all have to go through that process, realizing what it actually takes to create a music studio, to create a room that sounds good. Yeah. So don't give up. Keep on going. Good comment. And the next question is by Samuel Voga. Sorry about that. On the same video, so why you can't calculate how much treatment you need. And Samuel says, awesome as usual, Jesko. You're very welcome. I wonder at what point a room falls into the not small category. In other words, what sort of dimensions are we looking at when we talk about a large room, not a stadium though? So in theory, or in acoustic theory, we talk about a large room once those standing waves that I talked about before basically drop below the auditory spectrum. Yeah. So to think about this in more practical terms, I always like to say, think about a typical school classroom. Yeah. That's still a small room, mainly because of the height. But from there on out, we're talking about medium rooms and then going into large rooms. Yeah? So anything smaller than a standard school classroom, just as a very vague example, I would consider a small room because at least part of the standing waves fall into the auditory spectrum, and that makes them small rooms. All right, good question. Moving on, this one is by Lucas Nordhook on a video called Acoustic Panel Placement, When to Use Absorption and When Diffusion. Lucas says, I watched your videos, I Googled a lot of things, then I went to the Hornbach, which is a DIY store, a hardware store here in Germany. And I filled my room with 9 16 centimeter deep, 120 times 60 centimeter absorber panels filled with rock wool. I am very happy with the results. I've heard more detail in reference music than ever before. I filled about 15% of the surface area of my room with absorbers, placed the speakers and sub on the 38% point, and I used Sonarworks. I couldn't sleep last night. I was listening for hours as if all the music was presented to me for the first time. Thank you. That is amazing. I love to read this. This is exactly what I like to hear. Great. Well done. Well done. It just shows it doesn't have to be that hard. Yeah, you have to put in the work, but it all comes down to getting the fundamentals right. I would somewhat question the placement of the speakers and sub on the 38% point. Yeah, it might have worked out for you. Maybe you meant something slightly different there, but I do this. I recommend that you test your room in order to place your listening position and your speakers, and you can actually find my guides to doing that in the home studio treatment framework that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So you can get that completely for free in order to set up and find your listening position and set up your speakers. But apart from that, yeah, it's all about getting the fundamentals right. So often we're trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to acoustics, and it's just not necessary, Do the basics right. You basically put in the work to get the basics right, and then you get the results. And then you get what you just said, a sleepless night, because you just end up listening for hours because it sounds so amazing. So thank you and well done. Lovely, lovely comment. Okay, so this next one is by Aleph Music and More. He says, I hear a little bit of sweet Persian accent. Am I right? By the way, I really enjoy and learn a lot. Thanks for that. You're very welcome. I'd love it to be a Persian accent. This is a standard German accent. So I'm in Berlin, Germany, and obviously my English is probably, if anything, tainted by a German accent. But Persian would be sweet, I guess. Yeah, cool. Okay, next question is by K&J Music on a video called Bass Traps Having Trouble Finding the Best Bass Trap for Your Room. And he asks, someone wrote this on Facebook. Wood, especially layers, is a natural low frequency absorber because it moves and resonates at many frequencies in the audio spectrum. The mass of a layer of wood diffuses sound and absorbs sound. Is that true? Is wood, he mentioned OSD board and oak for flooring or absorbing. If wood is a great absorber of low frequencies, why not build bass traps out of big chunks of wood? You then get people saying less dense rock wool is better for absorbing lows than more dense rock wool. Is this true too? How can soft mineral wool but hard wood both be good at the same job? They seem like they would have the opposite properties. Thanks. Yeah, so your skepticism is very much on point. Obviously, wood, just plain wood on its own, is not a great absorber. I mean, you can never discount like some random resonance effect if you get a big sheet of wood and you hang it in exactly the right spot and it's exactly the right thickness and it's got exactly the right dimension, and you just so happen to stumble across some resonant frequencies that do exactly the thing you need. Yeah, but this is kind of like shooting blind. So generally speaking, wood is obviously not an acoustic absorber on its own. If you include that as part of a resonance system, then this is a completely different story. But then the wood becomes a membrane, which is a part of the resonance system. So a mass spring system where the mass is the sheet of wood which sits on a spring, a layer of air, usually in an enclosed box. And then you can tune that in order to absorb a particular frequency. Yeah. If you just have loose wood flooring, I think you mentioned that somewhere, then you can't expect that to do anything useful for you. It might, but I wouldn't recommend kind of counting on it, and I wouldn't recommend just building a very loose floor assuming that it's going to do something good for you. Yeah, what we actually try when we're building studios is quite the opposite. We try to remove unknowns and then work with knowns, so things that we can predict. Remove stuff that is unpredictable and do things that are predictable, because otherwise things just become chaos. Yeah. So obviously this is, I'm not sure what this person was referring to or where they picked this up. Often things are misunderstood, they're taken out of context, and then they don't make any sense anymore. So that's probably what's happening here. And obviously that also then means, or that kind of refers, or that includes the comment on the rock wool. Yes, less dense rock wool works better than more dense rock wool at the right depth, right? So this whole question of density is secondary to the depth question. You pick a certain depth of rock wool or porous absorption to get a certain bandwidth covered, a certain frequency bandwidth covered. Typically, we're talking about how low down in absorption this absorber absorbs. And then once we've decided on that, only then do we pick the density to basically optimize absorption at that depth. So we don't want to do it and make it too dense, because then the thing is this: if it's, let's say, this deep, if it's the material's too dense, the sound will go all the way in. And so we're kind of, the back part of it is basically useless. If you don't make it dense enough, then the sound won't be stopped by the time it exits on the back. Yeah, so you pick the depth first, and then all you do is pick the density to maximize or optimize absorption at that depth. Yeah, and especially when we're talking about deeper pores absorber constructions, let's say, then you really want to use quite a low density material. Does that cover the question? Is this true too? How can soft mineral but hardwood? Yeah, okay, exactly. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Yeah, it's just another example of how easy it is to get confused with this stuff. Yeah, it comes back to what I was saying about in the last question. Focus on the basics. Yeah, there's so much stuff here, or people try and reinvent the wheel constantly when we're talking about acoustics. And I personally don't understand why, because sure, it's fun to like experiment and do stuff, but don't we want to get back to actually making music, right? Isn't that what this is all about? So, but good comment. And this next one is by Christopher Hawthorne on a video called Small Room Acoustics, 3 Effects You Will Never Get Rid Of. And Christopher says, I've noticed that some mix engineers are doing away with the desk entirely, opting for a small tray just large enough to hold a keyboard and mouse, and use a larger computer monitor further back on the floor or rear wall. In such a case, what's to stop someone from placing absorptive material on the floor in front of the mix position? Don't we similarly treat the ceiling when we are hanging cloud panels? Or furthermore, is there any reason not to change the angle of the reflector surface in front of the mix position? Example, a large piece of plywood on the floor, or an angled desktop surface, so that the sound reflects at an angle that passes below one's ear at the mix position. So first of all, it's somewhat context dependent, right? When we're talking about home studios, they are small rooms, right? And well, let me start differently. Yes to all your questions. Yeah, you got it right. But this is obviously dependent on having enough space. Yeah, if you want to treat the space between your desk and your speakers, that kind of implies that there's quite a bit of space there, which means your room is big enough. And so that doesn't tend to be a home studio as I talk about it anyway. And with the second part of this, angling your desk, yeah, you can totally do that. In my experience, it's just not that comfortable to work on a angled desk. Yeah, so people have experiment with this all the time, and sure, it works. But then you also have to think about that you're going to be sitting at this desk possibly 8 hours a day if you're working professionally. And do you want to have this angled thing in front of you? I don't know. I definitely haven't seen anybody who's kept it that way. Let's just say it like that. Yeah. So there's theory and then there's practice, and oftentimes ergonomics play a larger role than you might think. But good question. And the final one. This one is by David Joshua on the video called Acoustic Reflections Wood Slats on Top of Absorbers. And David asks, couldn't you avoid this deadness by simply getting panels that absorb the proper rate and level needed by the surface? If the parameters are dependent on room usage, why not get it right the first time instead of using slats like these? Yeah, you're hitting on a good point. Basically, what you're saying is, why don't we just design the absorber so it does exactly what we want? In practice, that is what we're doing here. The thing is that you can't basically, there is no tool, there is no absorptive mechanism that does what you suggest on its own. That's the main problem, yeah? With porous absorption, they always absorb high end, and then the deeper you make it, the lower down in frequency that absorption goes. But there is no porous absorber that you can build that absorbs low frequencies, but doesn't absorb high frequencies. Technically, you could do that by just creating something that is really, really high density, but then you get into all sorts of other problems, mainly that the sound won't actually enter the panel. So in practice, there is no tool that does what you suggest. So we have to kind of find a workaround, and that is what these slats do. Yeah. But good question. Yeah, this is one of the trickier things, or one of the kind of things you only realize once you've thought about this for quite some time and understand how some of these tools work, is that the ideal tool sometimes doesn't exist. So we have to kind of work around that problem and find a way that this device still does what we want, but perhaps in a different way. Yeah. So, good question. That was it for this particular video. I hope you found those questions and answers useful. With that, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. That's what it's all about. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.